Hello guys, and welcome back to this budget van conversion series. In today's video I'm going to answer the question, do I need to install a consumer unit in my van conversion? The simple answer is yes, and there's a number of reasons why. As many of you pointed out on my previous wiring diagram video, I should have shown a consumer unit directly connected to the hookup connection coming into the van, and you're absolutely right. In order to comply with current British standards, a consumer unit is needed to be installed in our van on that incoming mains supply. Inside the consumer unit there's a couple of different devices. There's an RCD or residual current device, and this is here to protect us from receiving a fatal shock. So if there's a fault to earth on the system downstream and we perhaps touch an appliance which is live, we're not going to receive a shock that could actually kill us. This RCD device will detect that fault to earth and it'll isolate the circuit really quickly. The other device that's in here is an MCB or miniature circuit breaker. Now this is like a fuse, so this protects the system from overcurrent, from drawing too much current. If there's a fault between the line and neutral on the system and there's more current flowing than should do normally, this device will detect that overcurrent and then it will trip out. And the beauty with both of these devices is once you've identified the fault and rectified it, these can both be reset. So you don't have to replace them in terms of like normal rewirable fuses. So let's have a look at each individual device and how they actually work. Now for the purposes of our installation, because we're in the United Kingdom, we're using the British Standards and the British Standards BS7671. This is the 2018 edition, the 18th edition. It's been updated 4 times since. This current amendment was 2022, so only last year. I just want to give a huge shout out to Tom from Tiny Build Electrics. He got in touch with me and he knows that I like to keep my videos up to date with all the current regulations, and he kindly offered to send me a copy of the latest regulations so that this video can be bang up to date. So thank you very much, Tom. I really appreciate that. I've got some more information coming up, of things that Tom and I are going to get involved in which you may be of interest, so hang on till the end of the video for more information on that. Okay, so the current British standards. In section 721 at the back here, there is a regulation that covers electrical installations in caravans and motor caravans, so i.e. camper vans, exactly what we need. And in section 721 there's a couple of paragraphs that state that we do require additional protection in the form of an RCD. It needs to break both the live and neutral, all live conductors. So it needs to be a double pole RCD. So let's just have a look at what the RCD is and how does it protect us. So I'm just going to draw a simple line diagram on the board here to represent what's happening inside that RCD so we can better understand how it operates. Inside the RCD is a circular metal core. We'll have our line live conductor coming into the RCD via a switch internally, and then that line conductor will be wrapped around this metal core, and then that will go off out to our load or our device that's connected to it. We will also have the neutral coming into the device, also via a switch. That will be wrapped around the coil, same number of times on the opposite side, and then that will go off to our device or appliance, whatever we've got connected. So let's just draw a device, whether that be a water heater or something that's connected to the load further down. The live will be connected to that load. There'll be a heating element or something in there which is giving us the load, and then our neutral connections connected to that. And then in addition to our line and neutral, there'll also be an earth connection to that device, and that will come back to our consumer unit. So we'll have an earth connection, this is our line, and we'll also have our neutral. So during normal operation, the RCD is monitoring the flow of current within this circuit, and if everything's okay and the appliance is working okay, the current flowing down the line will be exactly the same as the current coming back on the neutral. And what happens in this coil is you get a magnetic field is built up in this coil, and because the current flow is the same, the magnetic field on the line and neutral will cancel each other out. Now what happens if for some reason we have a fault in the appliance, so we have a fault to earth, some of this current is going to leak out of the device and back down the earth. So let's say we could have something like 10 amps flowing down the line to this device, but some of the current is leaking out to earth. So for argument's sake, let's just say we had 1 amp leaking out along the earth, so we're only going to have 9 amps coming back on the neutral line. 10 amps going to the appliance, we've got our fault, some of it's coming back on the earth, so there's an imbalance across the line and neutral. So what happens is this magnetic field in here becomes stronger, and there's a small little coil in here. Wrapped around here is another coil which is monitoring that imbalance to a little solenoid, and that solenoid is connected to these 2 switches. So all the time that circuit is in balance, nothing happens to this solenoid. But as soon as we get a fault and that current leaks back down the earth, then there's an imbalance in this coil which triggers this solenoid, breaks these 2 switches. Now the human body can only withstand a very small amount of current, something in the region of 50 milliamps. Anything above that could be fatal as a shock across the body and across the heart. So an RCD needs to have a rating of less than 30 milliamps, and most of the ones that you'll see, certainly the ones that I shall recommend that you purchase, when you look on the actual RCD in the small writing on the front, I can clearly see here that this one is rated for 30 milliamps. So when you've only got literally 30 thousandths of an amp flowing to fault, that RCD will trip. And in fact, typically they normally trip anywhere between 15 milliamps to 30 milliamps. So it's a really small amount of current that it will detect. So the residual current device is primarily there to protect ourselves from receiving a lethal shock. If we make the circuit to earth, that RCD will trip instantly and avoid us getting a fatal shock. Now, is the RCD going to protect us if there's a short circuit, i.e. a connection between the line and neutral? Well, let's have a look at that, because let's say, for instance, in our previous example we had 10 amps flowing down the line and everything was okay with our appliance, and we've got 10 amps coming back, and then for whatever reason something happens to the system, a cable is cut, or catches on a sharp metal part of the van, or something in the appliance shorts out and there's a connection made between the line and neutral. So we have a short circuit between these 2 cables. Something's happened so that they're touching. Instantly, because you haven't got this resistance, there's going to be a huge surge in current flowing around the circuit. So these values of current are going to go up massively. Let's just say, up to 110 amps or even more instantaneously. But because nothing's leaking back down the earth, what's going down the line is the same as what's coming back on the neutral. So this RCD is still in balance. So this is not actually going to trip. It's going to allow all that current to flow down the circuit, and it's going to sit there quite happy. It doesn't see a fault in this case because there's not an imbalance across the line and neutral. So we need another device to protect us from overcurrent because the RCD is not going to give us that protection. So that is where the second device comes in the consumer unit, and they are the MCBs, or miniature circuit breakers. And as we touched on briefly before, basically they are like a fuse. So they're there for overcurrent protection. If in an overcurrent situation where you've got high current flowing, you want this device to break the circuit before those cables get too hot and could catch fire, obviously cause you a major problem. Now there are a few different types of MCBs on the market, so what do we need in our campervan to comply with the regulations? Well, section 721 states on final circuits, each final circuit shall be protected by an overcurrent protective device, MCB in our case, which disconnects all the live conductors of that circuit. So basically what that means is the line and the neutral are considered to be live conductors. So our MCB needs to be a double pole MCB. It needs to be able to disconnect both the line and the neutral of that circuit. Traditionally, the MCBs that you'll find in the consumer unit in your house will just be single pole. They'll only normally break the line conductor, and the neutrals will all be common together on a neutral bar. But for our campervan, and in order to comply with that regulation, ours are going to need to be double pole. So as you can see in this consumer unit, we've got the double pole RCD first, and then next to that we've got two double pole MCBs. So we can have two outgoing circuits here, and each of these MCBs will be capable of breaking the line and the neutral for its respective circuit. So how does the MCB work, and how does it differ from a normal wired fuse? Well, it actually works in two different ways. And we'll jump onto the computer, have a look at the internal workings of the MCB, and I'll explain how it works. So here we've taken the side cover of a miniature circuit breaker so you can see the internal workings. And there's a couple of key parts that we need to look at. You have the switch on the front of the device, which you can manually turn the circuit on and off. You have screw terminals top and bottom for the cable entry. But the two active items within the MCB that cause it to trip automatically are first this bimetallic strip, and secondly this little solenoid coil in the middle. Now the bimetallic strip is the key part that makes this device work. A bimetallic strip is made up of two different metals, typically copper or brass and steel, and these metals can expand at different rates when they're heated. The electrical current will flow through the bimetallic strip via the contacts. If the current gets too much, the bimetallic strip will start to heat up. The copper or brass side of the strip will expand at a greater rate than the steel side, and because they're physically bonded together, the strip starts to bend. As the heat increases as the current flows more and more through the device, eventually it will bend sufficiently to break the contacts. With a small overcurrent, the heating up of this bimetallic strip may take a few seconds. With a very large overcurrent, this will obviously heat up really quickly. And if there is a huge current flowing through the device, a magnetic field builds up in the solenoid coil, which trips the device almost instantly. Once the fault has been rectified and the device has cooled down, the switch can be manually reset. So you can see there that the MCB gives us two types of protection depending on how much overcurrent there is. If it's a very small overcurrent because we've just plugged in too many devices, it may be a long period of time before that little bimetallic strip curves enough to break those contacts. So we just need to be aware of that. If it's a short circuit and a lot of current flows, obviously that's going to heat up really quickly, and that little solenoid in there is going to trip the MCB almost instantaneously, or literally within a fraction of a second. Now there's one other point that has been discussed widely on various forums, and that's the need for the consumer unit to be housed in a metal box. Because the current 18th edition wiring regulations for domestic dwellings, so I guess they're referring to houses, now has the requirement for the consumer unit to be a metal clad box. And this is for the reasons of fire protection. If anything happens internally within the consumer unit which causes a fire, then having this in a metal box is going to restrict the outbreak of the fire from the consumer unit to wherever it's housed. And typically these are found under the staircase or in the entrance hallway of a building, so often in the escape route. So having it in a metal enclosure is obviously going to reduce the risk of fire breaking out of this cabinet, or at least slow it down enough for you to make a safe escape. Now, would you consider your camper van to be a dwelling? Yeah, I guess it is really. It's kind of like a little mini house on wheels. So realistically, it would make sense to have it in a metal enclosure. Now, I searched the internet and I couldn't find one that a company had produced for camper vans and motorhomes that had a metal enclosure that also complied to the current regs as far as RCDs and MCBs were concerned. This is the best one that I found. This is a power part unit. It's actually put together and marketed by Pennine Leisure Supplies. I'll put their details in the video description below. This is the best one I found on the market. It's got the right RCD, it's got the right MCBs, it's even got reverse polarity on the incoming mains. This little red light here, if the line and neutral are reversed on the hookup, this little light will give you an indication that there's a reverse polarity. So it's got some great features in it already. The only downside I think is it's in a plastic box. I think it could be better if it was in a metal box. Having said that, 721 section of the British Standards doesn't specifically say that it needs to be in a metal box, so you could argue that it still complies. But yeah, what's your views on that? Just leave me a comment in the comment section below. Of course, what you can do is purchase an empty metal box, take the MCBs and RCDs out of that unit and put them in a metal box and make up your own. Obviously there's a little bit of a cost implication in doing that, but then it could work out to be safer for you. So just to summarise, there's a few key things that you need to look out for when you're purchasing your RCDs and MCBs, and some of the small text on the front here is quite important. So let's just look at that. The RCD here has got a rating of 25 amps. Now, as we've seen before, that's not the overcurrent protection rating. It won't act like a fuse or a trip. So this 25 amp rating on this RCD is purely the switch rating of the contacts within inside this device. So this means that this RCD can handle up to a current of 25 amps on the switch contacts. So there's no real problem with going bigger on this RCD, 40 amp, 63 amp, even 100 amp, because it's just the rating of the contacts within this device. The bigger the rating, the more current it can handle. So potentially it's safer. So as long as that 25 amps is, I would say, is a minimum for a camper van. If it's slightly bigger, that's not a problem. So the RCD would need to be greater than 25 amps current rating. That's what you need to look out for. The thing to look out for is the level at which it breaks at. And for our purposes, to comply with the regulations, that needs to be 30 milliamps. And most of the RCDs that you'll find will be 30 milliamps. And then for the purposes of our installation in a camper van, to comply with that 721 regulation, it needs to be a double pole RCD, so it needs to break both the line and neutral. And to be honest, most of them are two pole RCDs. And then lastly, it has a type on here, and in this case it's type A. And what that refers to is the type of connected loads that you've got downstream of the RCD. Previous RCDs were type AC, so that was just for standard AC loads like heating elements and things like that, where there's no DC connected to the circuit. But nowadays we've got modern devices that have got microprocessor control, laptops, even simple things like washing machines and stuff like that. A lot of them now have got sort of microprocessor control, some level of DC control built into that AC device. And what tends to happen is they tend to leak a small amount of DC current back down the AC line. So what that does is that actually stuns our RCD, prevents it from working. So modern RCDs now that you need to be looking for as a minimum standard would be a type A RCD, and then that allows for a small amount of DC leakage current, and it will still break even if those devices are connected to the circuit. So as we're going to be using, modern electronic devices in our camper van, we need to have a type A RCD as a minimum. So those are the requirements for our RCD. Now for our MCB. The MCB will have a rating. It will either have a B, a C, or even a D rating. Now this relates to the time delay for the breaker to take effect. The smaller the letter, if you like, so B's, the quicker that it will break. So a B device will act faster than a C device. Now why would they be different? Well, some motors, pumps, even hair dryers, things like that, where they've got a motor which needs a high starting current to get the motor running, and then once it's running it falls back to its normal running current. They have an inrush of current, so you don't want your MCBs to be tripping every time you start a water pump. So the better type of breaker to operate that circuit would be a type C, because it's got kind of like an inbuilt time delay before that MCB will trip. For really basic circuits and a lot of domestic circuits, lighting circuits and things like that, they're on a type B breaker, because you haven't got that initial current rush when you turn the lights on, so you need them to act fairly quickly. This particular consumer unit that I've purchased comes with a type C breaker in here, so it will cover you for normal loads and for motor type loads or anything with a large starting current, like a roof fan, water pump, anything of that nature. So our MCBs typically for our camper van will be a type C MCB. Then you'd need to look at the number on here. We've got 6 and 10, and that's amps. That relates to the current that will flow through this device. So that's like your fuse rating of each device. And in this case we've got a 6 amp breaker and we've got a 10 amp breaker. So if there's an overcurrent in excess of 10 amps, there'll be a certain amount of time that bimetallic strip will heat up and this MCB will trip out. And there's a chart in the back of the British Standards for these particular devices. For a type C MCB of different amp ratings, there's a curve on the graph, on the chart, and you can look at that. You can look at the overcurrent and it will tell you on the chart exactly how long it will take before that MCB trips out. And then further down the chart it will tell you at what current the MCB will instantly trip. And some of those currents will be extremely large and quite surprising. So for a type C MCB rated at 10 amps, to make that MCB trip instantaneously, the short circuit current needs to be 100 amps. So anything below 100 amps, there's going to be a very short amount of time for that bimetallic strip to heat up and break the contacts. Anything above 100 amps, that little solenoid's going to trip it instantly. So we need to look at effectively the sort of fuse rating, if you like, for our circuits. Now all campsite hookups are no more than 16 amps single phase. So you wouldn't want any of these MCBs in this device to be more than 16 amps. So I would say that 16 amps wants to be your maximum. And realistically, if you're going to split that load across a couple of circuits, then those individual circuits need to be less than that. They need to be a combined amount. Otherwise, you've got to be really careful not to plug in too many devices and overload the system. And then finally, as we've seen in the regulation, the MCB needs to be able to break all live conductors. So in this case, it needs to be a 2-pole device. So it needs to be able to break the line and the neutral. And finally, I just want to touch on the fact that there could be in your installation in your van a situation, depending on what type of equipment that you've got, where you would need more than one consumer unit. For instance, you're definitely going to need one on the incoming hookup supply coming into your van. So we've just gone through that, that's a definite. But then if you've got an inverter which takes the 12 volt DC from your leisure batteries and converts that to 230 volt mains, on the discharge side of that inverter, you could possibly need another consumer unit. Now you need to check with your manufacturer of your inverter, because a lot of inverters are very, very different in the way that they deal with the output side of the AC off the inverter. Some have inbuilt protection built into the inverter, some don't. I've actually contacted Renogy directly regarding the inverter I'm proposing to put into our self-build camper van, and they've written back to me and confirmed that internally within their inverter they do have residual current detection, so they do have an RCD built into the inverter, which is great news. I don't then need to put an external consumer unit on that outgoing supply. I will obviously need to put overcurrent device, a fuse or a breaker downstream, but as I'm plugging a 3-pin fuse into the output of the inverter, a 3-pin plug, sorry, there'll be a fuse inside that 3-pin plug, which will give me overcurrent protection. So I know I'm covered. I won't need an additional consumer unit. But check with the supplier of your inverter, because a lot of them don't have any means of RCD protection built in, and you'll then need to have additional RCD external to the inverter on that outgoing supply. Now I'm going to cover the earthing and grounding of both 230 volt and 12 volt DC systems in campervans in a separate dedicated video. There's a lot to go through there, and I think it needs its own dedicated video in order to do that. I've been given so much help and advice by Tom of Tiny Build Electrics. He's been helping me out massively, and I'm hoping that I can get him to come along and come onto a video with myself and answer a lot of your questions about earthing and grounding. The guy is a font of knowledge. All of his systems obviously are built to the current regulations. He kindly offered to send me that copy of the 18th edition. So yeah, can't thank him enough. He's been a wealth of information for me to put these videos together. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask about earthing and grounding, or anything else that you've seen in your own electrical system that you're unsure of, or the systems that we've demonstrated so far, please do leave me your questions in the comments section below. Tom and I will then get together. We'll pick out some of the ones that we feel are really important, or if everybody's asked the same question, obviously we'll answer those. And hopefully between us, we can give you the right information that's up to date to the current regulations, and will put your mind at rest. So I hope you understood all of that information that we've gone through today. I hope it's helped to explain what these devices are, how they can make your installation safe, and how they can protect you when you're travelling around in your van. So if you've enjoyed it, please do give the video a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe, because we've got that earthing and grounding video coming up and you won't want to miss that. And thanks very much for watching. Cheers!